The sky over Draenix bled amber every morning. It was a merciless canvas, sun-scorched, wind-scraped, and endless. Beneath that painted inferno, Kalira staggered across the sand dunes, her limbs trembling from exhaustion, her senses dulled by the dry, rattling wind. 3 days had passed since her ship, the Talwyn Arrow, was struck down by pirates, scavenger beasts who had turned the desert into a hunting ground. She alone had survived, dragging herself from the burning wreckage and into a death walk across the planet's unforgiving face. Her body, built for the cool climate of Adrathi moons, was ill-suited for the heat of Draenix. The sun peeled at her skin, her tongue was thick and heavy, her thoughts blurred like heat waves over the distant ridges. She carried nothing now, no tools, no water, no signal beacon, just the will to move forward. She had once been called unbreakable, the last daughter of House Thalray, trained in celestial navigation and born into privilege and protocol. That title meant nothing here, where the horizon was the same in every direction, and her royal blood only made her dehydration more profound. As the wind kicked up once again, sand stung her face and lodged between her teeth. She fell to her knees, her breath shallow. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of light in the sky, fading. She didn't know how far she had walked. She didn't know if anyone would ever find her. She could only pray, though she didn't believe in gods, that she would not die without her name being remembered. Then, in the distant haze, a shape moved, low to the ground, tracked, metal glinting in the cruel sun. A vehicle. It was coming her way. She tried to stand. Her legs failed. She collapsed, half-conscious. But the shape grew closer, and the desert, for the first time in days, did not feel quite so infinite. Sergeant Thomas Kane never imagined he'd find anyone alive in that quadrant. Draenix's southern expanse was mostly red stone and dust. Even the raiders rarely ventured this deep into the desolation. His patrol was overdue for rendezvous, and the engine of his old recon rover coughed like it was half a mile from dying. But when the scanner chirped faintly, just a flicker of movement, he diverted course. He didn't expect much. Maybe a sandworm. Maybe a broken drone. Certainly not a person, but as the rover slowed beside the ridge and he stepped out into the blistering heat, he saw her, crumpled at the base of a dune like something sculpted by wind and left to erode. Alien. Female. Gaunt. Her limbs were too still for comfort. "Hey," he called out, voice cracking from the dry air. She didn't move. He hurried to her, sliding down the ridge and kneeling beside her. Her skin was a strange pale silver hue, her lips cracked, her breathing shallow. Eyes half-lidded. Alive. But barely. She whispered something, or tried to. Kane didn't understand the words, but he understood the desperation. Without hesitation, he reached into his belt pouch and pulled out the only ration he had left, a sealed hydration unit and a high-calorie meal bar. It wasn't much standard-issue emergency supply, but it was everything he had. He tore the packet open and placed the water capsule to her lips. At first, she didn't respond. Then her mouth moved and her throat convulsed. The water vanished quickly. She blinked, then focused on him. Her gaze was sharp, intelligent, and stunned. He placed the ration bar into her hand and gently closed her fingers around it. "That's all I've got, lady," he muttered. "But it's yours." For a long moment, she stared at him as if he'd dropped fire into her palms. In her world, no one gave without expecting a return. And here was a strange creature, scruffy, armored, smelling of sweat and oil, offering her his last bit of life without question. Her lips parted. A sound escaped, a soft click, almost a breath. Kane didn't know what she meant, but something in her eyes told him everything. He had just rewritten the story she'd prepared to die in, and neither of them would walk away unchanged. The rover's wheels groaned as it pulled away from the dune. Kalira lay in the back, wrapped in a thermal sheet Sergeant Kane had torn from the med kit. Her breathing had stabilized, but she barely moved, except to occasionally glance toward him with that same look, cautious, observant, and quietly disarmed. Kane kept one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally checking the old compass mounted on the dash. The vehicle's onboard GPS was shorted from last week's sandstorm, and the comm tower had gone dark 3 days ago. He was operating by instinct and what little was left of the map in his head. The rendezvous point was still another 60 kilometers north. No shade, no stations, just heat and rocks and miles of emptiness. He looked back at her once, catching her eyes in the rearview mirror. I'm Kane, he said. Sergeant, Earth Detachment. She blinked, and after a moment her mouth moved slowly, the syllables strange but beautiful in cadence. Kalira, he smiled. Nice to meet you, Kalira. You picked the wrong desert to crash in. She didn't answer, but he thought for a second her mouth curved, just slightly. The silence in the rover wasn't awkward. It was cautious, balanced. Two beings with no common language but one shared moment of survival. She'd eaten half the ration bar, tucked the rest under her arm, as if it were too precious to finish in one sitting. Kane offered her his canteen once. She sipped, gently, like someone who'd lived too long in a place where nothing was given freely. Later that night, they made camp by a shallow rock formation. Kane rigged up a crude heat shield, lit a low-flame thermal beacon, and gave her the second-to-last water capsule. She didn't want to take it. She pushed it back with a weak hand. But he insisted, tapping his chest and shaking his head. You need it more. She stared at him for a long time, then accepted it. He noticed the way she turned her head to the sky when the moons rose, how her expression softened, like someone remembering a home they hadn't seen in a long time. Her face in the moonlight wasn't just tired, it was lonely. And Kane, for the first time since setting foot on Draenix, felt something stirring that had nothing to do with duty or survival. Something human. Something real. By the third day, Kalira was strong enough to sit beside him in the rover's cabin. She said little, but her eyes had grown more alert, tracking the dunes, the horizon, the shapes in the sand with silent vigilance. Kane noticed at first when she tensed, her hand gripped the dash, her chin lifting sharply. What is it? He asked. Then he saw it. Dust plumes. Too fast, too coordinated for a natural storm. Raiders. He cursed under his breath, jerking the wheel and cutting a wide arc behind a hill of jagged red stone. The rover wasn't built for combat. It barely had shielding, and his rifle had 2 shots left. Kalira was already reaching into her belt. What little remained of her suit still held a blade, folded and scorched, but serviceable. She nodded toward the higher ridge as if to say there, a better spot to defend. Kane trusted her instinct. They left the rover and climbed the hill, crouching behind the rocks just as the first of the raider bikes crested the distant dune. There were 4, lean, jagged machines with exposed turbines and riders wrapped in sand veils. Kane handed Kalira the rifle. She took it without hesitation. You sure you can handle this? She glanced at him once, then clicked a series of sharp sounds in her throat, tones that might have been language or a promise. He kept the pistol. She took the rifle. The first raider dismounted and approached the rover, unaware. Kalira fired, 1 shot. Clean. The second tried to swing around the flank. Kane caught him mid-curve, firing low, straight into the fuel tank. The explosion scattered the rest, sending the final 2 fleeing into the southern ridges. Kane leaned back against the rocks, heart pounding. He turned to her. She was still watching the horizon, her expression calm, composed, as if she'd done this before. Remind me not to get on your bad side, he said, exhaling. She looked at him then, truly looked. Her lips moved. A whisper, soft. Thank you. It wasn't perfect. Her voice was raw, accented, but it was unmistakably in his language. He blinked. You speak standard? She touched her throat, shook her head, then signed something with her hands, slowly. He didn't know what it meant, but he didn't need a translator to understand what her eyes were saying. She didn't just owe him her life anymore. Now he owed her something too. And in that silence between them, the bond that had formed in thirst and fire deepened into something neither had expected. A loyalty forged not by language, but by sacrifice. By the 5th day, the desert no longer felt like a prison. It still whispered of death and desolation, but the silence between Kane and Kalira had transformed. What once was necessity had become rhythm. They moved together now, not in speech, but in mutual understanding, like dancers who had long since memorized each other's steps. Kalira walked beside the rover, her stride stronger with every kilometer. She had begun to hum softly at night, strange melodies from her world, low and haunting, like the voice of a star mourning its own collapse. Kane didn't understand the notes, but he found comfort in them. They reminded him that she still had pieces of her home alive inside her, even if the rest had burned in wreckage and wind. One night, while camping beneath a jagged overhang of petrified coral, Kane built a fire from scrap and kindling. The flames crackled low, illuminating her face as she sat cross-legged opposite him, head tilted, watching him carefully. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn object, a circular patch, the kind issued to Earth soldiers. The edges were frayed, the words faded. She leaned forward. "5th Terra Recon," he said, tapping it. "Lost most of them during the siege of Pharos." She watched his hand, then looked back at his face. He smiled dry. "I've been out here too long." She reached toward the patch with reverence, brushing her fingers across the insignia. Then she removed a clasp from her own torn belt, a curved emblem of dark alloy. She set it on the ground between them. Cain leaned closer. It was elegant, shaped like a crescent moon coiled around a falling star. His fingers hovered above it, but he didn't touch. "Is that yours?" She nodded, tapped her chest once, then mimed fire with both hands, gesturing an explosion, then dust in the wind. He understood. Her ship, her crew, gone. He looked into her eyes. "I'm sorry." She reached across the fire and touched his wrist, brief but deliberate. Forgiveness or gratitude, maybe both. That night, under the stars, they did not speak. But Cain found himself listening more intently than he had in years, to her breathing, to the hum of the desert, to the sound of two people beginning to matter to each other. The final stretch of their journey took them through the shattered maw, a formation of canyon ridges and cliffs so jagged that locals called it the Teeth. Navigation was nearly impossible without orbital support, but Kalira knew how to read shadow and slope, mapping by instinct where Cain's outdated compass failed. They traveled by foot now. The rover's fuel cell had finally given up. Cain carried the last rations in his pack, while Kalira led the way through ravines and narrow chasms that sang with wind. At one point, she stopped, crouched low, then gestured for him to duck. He dropped instantly. Voices garbled, guttural, not human, echoed through the canyon. Raiders. A patrol. They pressed their backs against the rock, hidden behind a jagged wall as two figures passed above them on a ledge. Cain felt Kalira's breath against his neck. Her hand hovered at her waist where her blade remained strapped. But they didn't move. They waited, still as stone, until the sounds faded. Once it was clear, she stepped back and looked at him, her face unreadable. Cain gave her a shaky grin. "You always this good at staying alive?" She smirked, his first time seeing it. Barely there, but it curved her lips and lifted her brow like a flicker of mischief. She pointed at him, then mimed a heart thumping fast in a cage. "Yeah," he muttered. "You and me both." By sunset, they reached a ridge where the cliffs broke open and the land flattened. In the distance, he could see it, a communications tower, rusted but intact, still flashing a signal beacon. They'd made it. He turned to tell her, but froze. Kalira had fallen to one knee, her hand over her chest. "Kalira?" He rushed to her, kneeling beside her. She shook her head, breathing hard. "Too much," she whispered, voice hoarse. Cain pulled out the last ration, a compact water capsule, and held it out. She tried to push it away. "No," she mouthed. "Yes," he said firmly, uncapping it. "You brought me through the maw. You get the last drink." She took it, finally, and sipped. Not much, just enough. They sat together there, side by side, overlooking the flat plain, the signal tower blinking like a heartbeat in the distance. "You saved me," he said softly. She turned to him, her hand gently touching the edge of his jaw. Her fingers brushed over the scar near his temple. "No," she whispered in her broken standard. "We saved each other." And with the night rising around them, neither of them felt alone anymore. Because in the heart of a wasteland designed to kill, they had found something impossible. A reason to live. And someone worth living for. They reached the comm tower at dawn. It stood crooked over the flat expanse, a monolith of rust and half-dead wiring, humming like a tired beast that had somehow refused to die. Cain approached it cautiously, guiding Kalira with a steady hand on her back. Her breath was still shallow, but her eyes were locked on the signal light at the top, pulsing red against the pale sky. He broke open the maintenance panel with his knife, exposing a tangle of weather-worn circuits. Sand had gotten into everything. It would take time. He knew the codes barely, but this wasn't just about punching in numbers. The transmission coil needed realignment. The solar array was almost toast. Kalira sat on the stone beside him, watching. After a moment, she reached into the toolkit he'd set down and pulled out a component, then another. She didn't hesitate. Her hands moved with precision, her fingers working through broken conduits like a concert pianist returned to her forgotten instrument. Kane blinked at her. "You know tech?" She nodded once modestly, then signed. "Ship systems, flight core engineer." Of course she was, and here he'd been calling her navigator for 3 days like some kind of caveman. Together, they worked for hours, sweat mingling with dust and grime. Every so often, Kane looked up from the panel and found her watching him, not as a stranger, not as a soldier, but as something warmer, familiar. When the tower finally buzzed to life with a clear transmission tone, Kane leaned back and laughed, loud and full. The sound echoed across the rocks, startling a flock of winged dust hawks from a nearby ridge. He opened the comm channel. "This is Sergeant Kane, Terran Recon, stranded in Grid 7G Delta. Survivor rescued. Request immediate extraction." The reply came seconds later, crackly but real. "Copy that, Sergeant. Extraction team en route. ETA 3 hours. Kalira sat beside him as the signal repeated overhead. They stared across the sands in silence. 3 hours, Kane murmured. She looked at him, then signed again. "What happens after?" He hesitated, because the truth was, he didn't know. She wasn't Terran, she wasn't military. And the universe, tight-fisted and territorial, didn't offer much space for unregistered aliens, without visas, without governments, without leverage. He could get her on the ship, but then, they might separate them. He looked at her, searching her face for fear. There was none, only resolve, and something dangerously close to hope. They didn't speak much in those 3 hours. There was nothing left to explain. Kalira had curled beside him in the shade of the tower, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, her fingers idly tracing a pattern in the dust. Kane sat still, letting her draw lines over the back of his hand, symbols from her language maybe, or memories. When the dropship roared over the horizon, dust pluming behind it like a wave of gold, Kane stood slowly. He offered her his hand. She took it. The Terran crew disembarked quickly, efficient and faceless in their dark exosuits. Medics swept over them first. They scanned Kane, then turned to Kalira. Unknown species, alien, unregistered. The lead medic frowned. Kane stepped in front of her before the words could go further. "She's with me." The medic tilted his head. "Sergeant, protocol requires." "She saved my life. If I hadn't found her, I'd be buried under 3 feet of sand and raider bones." The medic exchanged a glance with the officer nearby. "Still have to clear her through command. She'll need to be processed, held." Kane's voice hardened. "You put her in a cage, you'll have to explain it to my superiors, and to me." There was a pause, then a nod. "She flies with you." Kane turned. Kalira stood silently behind him, listening, reading the space between their words. She touched his back gently. "Another thank you." They boarded the ship. As the desert shrank beneath them and the stars brightened ahead, Kane leaned over and whispered, "You know, I never thought the last thing I'd find on this rock was the one thing I wanted to keep." She tilted her head, confused. He grinned, then carefully pronounced each word. "You saved me." Kalira blinked, then placed her fingers over his chest. A reply needed no words. Not anymore. The recovery ship drifted silently above the pale blue orbit of Draenix, a gleaming symbol of Terran efficiency, white corridors, sterilized lighting, and cameras in every corner. Kane hated the way it smelled. Not just the cleanser and recycled air, but the thinness of the place, like everything human in it had been bleached. Kalira sat on the edge of the medbay bed, legs crossed, silver eyes alert. The doctors had scanned her 5 times in 6 hours. Not out of malice, Kane believed that, but out of cold, clinical curiosity. She was unique, unregistered, and she hadn't spoken since arrival. Kane stood in the corner, arms folded, eyes locked on the officer outside the window. Captain Henley. Pale, stern. A man who treated policy like gospel and anything unpredictable like a virus. He'd already tried to separate them twice. "She's undocumented, Sergeant," Henley had said. "Even under open rescue terms, she needs to be held for processing." "And what if she doesn't survive another cell?" Kane had replied. "What if the last 5 days are the only reason she's still breathing?" Henley hadn't liked that. Now Kane paced beside her, unable to keep still. "I've seen them do this before," he said. "They'll call it debriefing, but they'll keep her locked in a room. She'll be alone again." Kalira touched his hand gently. When he turned, she signed one slow phrase. "Do not fight for me where I can fight with you." He didn't respond right away. Then he nodded. He took her to the officers' conference hall himself. The room was circular, white, and sharp, like being judged inside a blade. A tribunal of 3 Terran officials waited with unreadable faces. Kane stood beside her as she stepped forward. She took a breath. Then, without fear, she spoke. "I was born in the twin moons of Vexus Prime. My people are gone. I am the last voice of a burned ship and a language the galaxy does not need." Her voice was raw, heavily accented, but steady. "I survived alone, and then a human gave me his last food, his last water. He did not know my name. He did not ask for mine." She turned to Kane, then back to them. "I do not want a planet. I do not want asylum. I want choice. I choose him." A long silence followed. Then Kane stepped forward, his jaw set. "She saved my life more than once. I'll take full responsibility for her relocation, integration, whatever damn term you want, but if she's staying anywhere, it's with me." The oldest official, a dark-eyed woman, folded her hands. "On what grounds?" He looked down at Kalira, then said quietly, "On the grounds that she belongs where she was first seen." 6 weeks later, the desert was only a memory. Kalira stood on the deck of the recovery station orbiting Kalexar, wearing a civilian suit tailored to her alien form. She was different now, still quiet, still sharp, but her gaze no longer flinched from human stares. The crew had come to know her. Some respected her. Others kept their distance. But she was no longer nameless. She had taken Kane's name as her record tag, Kalira Vance. Not ownership, not surrender, but bond. Kane found her watching the stars again, leaning against the steel railing. "You always look like you're waiting for someone," he said softly. She didn't answer at first. Then, "I wait to forget that I once thought dying in sand would be easier than being remembered." He stepped beside her, reaching into his coat. He held out something small, a ration bar. She stared, then laughed, truly laughed, for the first time since he'd met her. "You kept that?" she asked. "It was my second to last," he grinned. "Figured I'd need it if you turned out to be trouble." "I did," she said, "and I still am." She took the bar, unwrapped it, and broke it in half. She handed him one piece. He stared at it. "Sharing this time?" he said. "I have enough now," she said simply. They stood together, under the soft hum of starlight and the low music of docking bays and homebound ships. The desert hadn't taken her. It had given her something rare. Someone who gave without asking. Someone who stayed. And now, in the quiet between galaxies, Kalira leaned her head against Kane's shoulder, finally letting herself believe that not every world was cruel. Some were worth returning to, some were worth choosing, and one had chosen her first.